Welcome to the I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. The podcast is dedicated to conscious souls looking to change the world. Astrologer by day, climate activist by night. Here is your host, Debra Silverman.
I am only human. I have my faults and my shadows that are as bright as the light that shines within.
Welcome to the I Don't Believe in Astrology podcast. This is so much fun. This is very spontaneous, as all of my interviews are. Kristen Wolf is one of my favorite people. We met, I want to say like 3,000 years ago. She came for a reading when she was very short, and it was like really random. How many years ago is that?
That is such a good question. I would say it would have to be somewhere on the order of like 15.
Exactly.
Maybe more, maybe 20.
It's so funny. So I have been Kristen's astrologer, which is going to be a very helpful conversation, because when she entered the conversation, she was randomly coming to see me. And as time went on, it got so strong that we became allies in a very energetic, spiritual way, to the point where she did an intensive and I really got to go into her story. So what I want you to know first about Kristen on the outer world, because she's Pisces, is her credentials, or the reason why she's here is she is a very successful writer. Her first love, Gemini rising. So can you talk a little bit about your accomplishments? We'll start on the outside.
On the outside. Well, my accomplishments are very, well, first of all, I think my number one accomplishment, and I know you and I have talked about this a lot, is being a parent. And that came a little later in my life, but I definitely hold that as my most precious and
meaningful contribution.
Definitely. Externally speaking, yes, I've written a few books. They're fiction. And most recently, I've turned toward producing and actually making some films and producing some theater and also some other documentary films. The films I make are narrative, but I've also turned to producing some Broadway theater and some documentary films.
Okay.
I'm all over the map.
All of that was totally understated. So she just did it until she dropped the word Broadway. So I want you to know that her success begins, one of the most significant markers, which I read, was the book called The Way. And this was endorsed by Oprah and on the bestseller list of Oprah. And can you just share with us, I read the book, and I was just talking about it yesterday. I can't get it out of my head. It never left. And can you just give us your little, elevator shortcut to what that book was about?
It's really hard for me to do elevator shortcuts about books. And I know that I'm not the only author that suffers from that, but it's essentially about a young girl who is in ancient Palestine, who, because of her unusual appearance, which today we would describe her as androgynous or masculine of center, basically is kicked out of her family and sold to a band of shepherds, where she learns how to live and present as a young man. And she learns a lot of wisdom from the shepherds, etc., until she is eventually abducted by a group of spiritual women, this sort of secret sisterhood that's living in this cave system, and she's taken away. And they strip her down and say, you're not a young boy after all, you're actually a young woman. And they start to teach her in their ways, which are very Gnostic, paganistic beliefs that predated Christianity and the other major religions. And what eventually happens is they're attacked. Their teachings unleash sort of a newfound power and wisdom within her. Her name is Anna. And it all looks like it's going great. She thinks she wants to live with the sisters forever and preserve their wisdom until they're attacked by forces that deem them threatening. And she's cast out again into the world with the surviving sisters. And the only way that they can survive is by her returning to her disguise as a young man. And they go on to try and preserve the sister's wisdom out in the world. And in doing so, you come to realize who this person actually is, this young woman in disguise as a man. And it becomes that she becomes this great spiritual teacher who we know as Jesus.
Okay, stop right there. This is the imagination of a Pisces. I'm going to show you her chart in a moment with Gemini rising. So in our system of astrology, Pisces is the imagination, and it has the capacity to conjure. And in the conjuring, it has time travel. And it begins to go beyond the veil of what we consider right and wrong, timelines, male and female, and she created a new reality. So reading this book, which is why Oprah endorsed it, was completely captivating because you slip through a little time warp. And this is in essence what Kristen does. Now she's understated, I got to say this, because she's Gemini rising. So what is Gemini rising? It's her soul. The rising sign is the soul. And her soul is a communicator and a storyteller, but it's the funniest thing about Gemini rising is they don't really want to talk. It's the funniest thing. So we started this podcast by her saying, well, I say, are you kidding? When she writes, she becomes a wordsmith. And it is an entrance, and that was one of her books. There has since been others, and recently this binary conversation about our being fluid around gender and not limiting what the mindset of the here and now is around gender and opening up the door for the future. So I just want to say one of your gifts, and I'm going to present your chart here in a moment, is that you do live in a world where, let me just say, how would I put that? Where you suspend the notion of time. Would that be an accurate way to put it?
I think that's accurate. Yes. And suspend sort of assumed boundaries and assume just assumptions in general, I think, and givens,
Right. So she reduces. So just for those that are astrologers, this is always the audience that doesn't believe in astrology, but I want to show you in the 10th house, this is the house of fame. It's the very top of the chart. So she was born at 10:30 in the morning when the sun was just coming over the top of the sky. So she's a professional Pisces, which is a dreamer who met mainstream. It's not just the Pisces who lives floating around. She's always trying to bring things into our present day world. Then she has this Gemini rising right here, which is the communicator, the wordsmith, the person that can articulate. And then this is my favorite part. She's born under a full moon. Let's see if we can get this to go away. Hey, can you move? Oh, there's the full moon opposite the sun. You can see the big red line. The moon is in Virgo, Pluto is in Virgo, and Uranus is in Virgo. So here is where the inspiration of a perfectionist, because oh my God, we're going to talk about the writing process, and the level of the future. Here's Uranus, the planet of the non-traditionalist, sitting next to her moon, and Pluto, passion for absolute purity. So a professional dreamer with an appetite for purity that comes with wordsmith. How'd I do?
It's really cool.
And by the way, she has not studied yet. If I could take her and stick her in my class, you bet I would. And the thing that's unnecessary for a Pisces to study is there is an access point through the dream time. And most of all, what I notice about you, I want to speak to the sun in the 10th house, is your insatiable commitment and appetite for continuing to study. So talk to me about your intellectual hunger to never stop learning. Like, what do you read for fun, Kristen?
That's a sad, you really hit the nail on the head there. For fun, I read science journals primarily. Like that is like people's equivalent of junk food or binge worthy. Like New Scientist is very binge worthy to me. And I would much rather sit down and read scientific journals than I would anything else. And I don't watch Netflix stuff. I don't really get hooked on that. I just really like to read what's happening in the world of discovery, really. Okay,
and I'm going to show you one more factor. So on the very top of the chart, which everyone we've looked at in our podcast, this word MC is the very top of the chart. So here's your mom giving birth. It was 10:30 in the morning, so the sun was just above her head, but Mercury and Venus were sitting on the top of your chart in the sign of Aquarius, which is the scientist. So this is the most predominant influence in your chart, besides this full moon and the purity, is this unbelievable intellect. Mercury's the mind. Venus is what she loves, in the sign of the scientist, sitting at the very zenith of the sky. So you were born with this, like, you promised this life. The zenith of the sky is our mission. And you said, I'm going to go down there and take my mind as an artist. You'll make my mind into an artist and I'll do science with it. So what science, like, you eat these magazines for candy. What is the topics that tickle you?
Everything. And that's the thing, is that there's really no limit. And it's almost like sadistic in the sense, not sadistic, the other one. But it's like, I want to go masochistic. I want to, like, I'll go after quantum theory, just as I'll go after, the lives of dung beetles and how they reproduce or follow. They use the Milky Way to navigate. Like, I will read everything, because what's interesting to me, and what happens, and I don't take credit for this, it's like how my brain works, is I don't have a huge amount of hard drive memory. In other words, I don't retain information very well. That said, my RAM, which is where, temporary information is stored and sorted and combined, to me is phenomenal. Like, I love to watch it work. And why I like to eat all of these disparate subject matters is because they go in, and it can be in one sitting. It's especially better if it goes in at one sitting. And you have all of these different pieces of information that seem unrelated. And then I don't know how or why, but my brain just starts firing connections. And it's like this combinatorial synthesizing way of thinking. And then it spits out new possibilities. It relates information that doesn't seem at all related. And then that usually is followed by a story idea, how I could incorporate that into a narrative that would be, entertaining.
And I think one of the overlying themes that I've heard from, especially the last film that you were doing, in the conversation about the binary, the conversation of the androgyny, your fascination is Gemini rises, your soul. And this is, I think, the future, by the way. I think what the future is this old construct of society describing male and female. I don't know where they came up with this, like, primal version that is so ancient, but your function has been to introduce us. And I watched your last film and was so moved to start to let ourselves open up our mind into this, I think, futuristic scientific entrance, where that distinction is no longer binding to the nature of our reality. Can you speak to that?
Yes. What's so interesting is when I say that I enjoy looking beyond assumptions, is because that's what a scientist does. And I remember this one, and I can't remember who it was, but he talked about, it was something to do with the blood-brain barrier, and it was assumed that there wasn't one. And then it was discovered that there is via the lymphatic system. And they were asking him, well, why did it take so long for anyone to figure this out? And he said, well, you can't find what you're not looking for. You can't find what you assume doesn't exist, because the assumption is there that it doesn't exist. So I've always been very suspicious of these assumptions that we have, particularly as humans. So I like to erase those assumptions and go in and assume that anything is possible. And when you talk about, like, sexuality or gender identification and our hard and fast rules around that, or traditionally our hard and fast rules around that, of course, immediately it triggers my instinct to question that. And one of the things that I toy with a lot is there's so much that we don't know. And I wish we made more allowance for that. Because, for example, I've studied mutations, mutants, human beings since the very early times. Tetralogy was the study of monsters, and essentially this arose from the study of children who were born with quote unquote defects or deformities. that are, and I have actually traveled in Europe and gone to the places where some of these small fetuses and whatnot are stored in medical facilities in these jars, in these clear jars. And it's intense to see. And you realize what the human imagination or the human assumption machine did when they would see a baby born without a head and with horns and with wings that were really just shortened limbs. And so I've studied things like that, like conjoined twins and whatnot. And I was born with, I've always had this suspicion that people who identify as they, them, or gender fluid, or two-spirit, or the shamans who, the earliest shamans who were either or and had a certain androgyny. I can't help but wonder if there is not a twin that they began life in the womb as, and that twin was, instead of becoming conjoined twins, might have been absorbed into one individual. It happens all the time. Could that perhaps spark this sensation of having two different persons within your one body? So I guess that's what I would speak to, is that there are so many things we do not know, but you can't, science will eventually catch up to these feelings that we have, to these instincts. And that's what I think is fascinating and really fertile ground. And it's shame on us for, I think, leaping to conclusions and needing everything to be clearly labeled in boxes and cut neatly. I don't think that's how life operates.
This is the function of astrology, is the distinction of every human being allowed for diversity, so that you meet someone like you and say, oh, and your function, like in the bumblebees, there was always one bumblebee that would leave. It's still true. It leaves the town it lives in, the little hub, and it goes off to find new land. And they call those the deviants. Right. And then they back and they, excuse me, and then everyone goes over. So there's always someone in the culture who is expected to step away from the norm, to go off to find another version, so evolution can occur. And I think this conversation of male female, and I'd love for you to speak to this, that in your own experience of male female being your own sexuality, or how it came to be that you've allowed, because I see your freedom of acceptance of yourself, and then trying to give us, the others, permission for diversity. How would you address that? How did you realize it? How did it first show up?
Sort of my gender identity, yeah. I mean, when you're a child, you're free, right? For the most part. And 0 to 6 or whatever, I was very free. I called myself Joe, and I ran around, I think in my own mind, assuming I was a little boy. I mean, I was my life. And that was also the very same time that we were a very religious family, and I would go to church and catechism class and all of that. And all I wanted to do was be an altar boy and, participate somehow in this spiritual endeavor that meant so much to me. And the Boy Scouts too. I wanted to participate in that, by the way. And it was horrible because these things were denied me in ways that sports weren't, because I was on the Little League. I was on the boys' Little League team, and I played with boys soccer and all of that. So I was accepted there. But in my spiritual life, I felt really excluded, really kicked out, which is why I ended up nicking a bunch of stuff from our church and holding mass in my driveway for a whole bunch of neighborhood kids. And I was the priest, right? So, and that's really actually where the way got started. I just wanted to appear and be able to participate in a meaningful way in my spiritual life, which I was very spiritual as a child. But anyway, at some point in your life, it was made clear to me that I'm not a young boy, and this is not a proper way for me to behave. And then I ended up going deep into some sort of hiding for many, many years, at least until at least until I was probably about 20, although I had been with someone when I was 16. I'd been with another young woman, and that was a very meaningful relationship for me. So, but then I just buried that and carried on. And eventually somewhere in my 20s, you know, I escaped and I didn't know anybody who was queer growing up, and even mostly through college. And then eventually I started to meet people, and my feelings became too large to hide. And then I guess I came out, and it wasn't always, it's really interesting. There's this quote by Alexander Leon, who's like a queer activist and a writer. And he talks about how queer people we don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up as some version of ourselves. And at least in generations past, we grow up as some versions of ourselves that we think will be acceptable and will avoid prejudice and will avoid humiliation. And that sort of the adult work of a queer person is to sort of unpack the parts of yourself that are genuinely you and the parts that you adopted to protect yourself. And I do think, at least in those earlier generations, that's exactly what I experienced as well. And it's been and continues, I think always will continue to be, just a journey in figuring out which parts did I put on because I felt I had to, and which parts are genuinely real.
And in your recent film, and imagine continues to be, this conversation continues to show up.
Yeah, absolutely. It's in part because I'm responding in part to my own journey, but I'm also turning outward and looking at so many other journeys that are being made and how brave people are being, and feeling really wanting to support people's courage to give themselves permission to be who they are and how they are. And anything that I can do to support that, I would like to do. It's something that I wish I would have had growing up. And so I want to support the other people who are putting those images into the world and braving the world as their raw, authentic selves. I just want to support that and help people who may not be as far along in understanding have an entry point for real, vulnerable conversation, learning conversations that you sort of just leave your assumptions at the door and step in and try to see with new eyes. And that's what I'm trying to help support.
And your work with Broadway and what just happened in New York, can you speak to that? Is it related?
Yes, it's very much related. I think it was so I spend time going back and forth between New York. That's where I was born, and it's a city that just fuels me. The city and its people fuel me in a way no other place does. So I'm fortunate enough to be able to spend time going back and forth to the city, and I adore theater. That's another secret love. And one day I was working, and I hit some sort of a wall or exhaustion point. And I said, all right, I'm just going to walk up and go see a show. And I keep a list of shows that I've read about or that I'm excited to see. And I went up to see a show written by Michael R. Jackson called A Strange Loop. It's actually a musical. And it's a show unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was up at Playwrights Horizons at the time back then, which is a smaller off-Broadway theater. And the story, which is of a queer Black man who...
I heard about this. It's supposed to be absolutely, totally remarkable.
It's an absolute phenomenon, a gift. It's a gift from Michael and the cast and crew to all of us. It's about a young queer Black man who basically wants to write musicals and is working as an usher for the Lion King. And he has this dream, and everything, including his own thoughts, who are characters in the show, are against him. His family's against him. His mind turns against him. Society and societal expectations, both queer and straight, are against him. And it is his journey to some place of self-acceptance and even celebration. And I can only say that I came out of the theater. I mean, I was in tears and I was just dissembled. I couldn't get myself back together. And as I was walking home, I thought, that show, I wish that show was on Broadway. It should be on Broadway. Everyone should see shows like that. I would like to do everything I can to support those voices in the world. So I didn't know anything about Broadway, but I started just asking questions, and friends and people put me in contact with anybody you know. And I was put in contact with some people who were producing shows on Broadway. And I got really excited. And I told them that I had seen A Strange Loop and I wanted to get involved, yada, yada. And then COVID hit. And I didn't go to New York for a couple of years. And obviously theaters were shut down. Fast forward a couple of years, I'm going back and I get wind that A Strange Loop, due to some very insightful people, was on its way to Broadway. And I got so excited. I said, how can I get in and help? And they had, there were a couple of producers, LGBTQ plus and BIPOC producers, who needed support. And that's how I got in. So I invested with them in their careers and in the show. And then it won the Tony for Best Musical and Best Book. And it was like an otherworldly experience. And I could not be more happy for
And
all.
the moral of that story is, Pisces, follow your dream. And when your emotional body is activated because your soul is screaming at you, don't walk over that. You allow the tears, you allow the dismantling and the disassembling, and then you say to yourself, as you did, what can I do to help? Let this be the message right here, live time. This chart that you have of the ambition, this Pisces in the 10th house, the professional Pisces who takes the dream and brings it down to earth because of that full moon and those 3 planets, you're like, we're going to make this happen. So I just want to acknowledge this is where astrology hits the ground. It's the difference between many of us listening to you who say, I have a dream, or I have a passion, or I really care about the earth. That's one of our topics on most of our podcasts, or I really care about astrology. But then when's the translation to putting that into the form? And that is your mastery, may I say.
Well, I'm glad to know that. I am, because sometimes it feels like you just, I think there was such a long period of my life where I felt like I just wasn't making anything happen. I was always so frustrated.
When was that?
Oh, that was all my 20s and even my 30s, and even some of my 40s. Less so, because by then I was a mom, and you know, I had finally published my first book, and so things were moving a little bit. But I think I always feel frustrated because I tend to have far more ideas than I can manifest. So that is the main point.
The 10th house is a late bloomer.
Well, if that's true, then that's it.
And that's
really now. It's happening
we're in your phase. And I said this to you in our last encounter when I got to hang with you, was Jupiter was coming to get you. The world was open.
Right.
Everything is timing, said the astrologer. Right. And yes, your Gemini is impatient, but your dreams are not. They continue to cook. Yeah. It's very true. If it is the sign of late bloomer, it's very true, because I do feel like something switched somewhere around when I turned 50, and as you would say, something got activated. Jupiter came and found me. However, it's like I went from being a very committed introvert with extrovert tendencies to very team player, collaborator, seeking out people in a way that I never had done before. And that is a stark contrast to how I spent much of my life. And it's actually really thrilling. And it's an amazing ride right now. And just knowing about and having been privy to you making that film and doing it with the team, as we always see in a film, and your ability to work with the team, this is to your credit, again, to Pisces, Gemini, tracking everyone and doing a peaceful playing field that everyone's playing their role. You have this magical chemistry, and it doesn't show up in the film business. So much of the people that I know, there's such an industry there that has a bad taste for many people because of the competition and the quality.
Yeah.
You did not do that. So can you speak
No.
a little bit to the quality of your love of doing that team sport?
Wow, that's such a great, I never thought of that comparison, because when I was doing sports, which obviously I did for a very long time, I don't know if it was fortunate or unfortunate, because I for whatever reason, was very athletic, and I ended up spending probably more time than I would have ever wanted doing team sports. But that's such a great analogy, because I was often captain of the team. And so it's always your job as captain to make sure that everyone feels like seen, encouraged, part of the team, play their specific role. And I think that's how I like to work on a film set, or even when I was directing theater many years ago. The way I look at it, I had worked as a peon and a PA, production assistant on films before, and I was always privy to people's discontent on set, and often it was the crew. So I worked with costume designers, I worked with set decorators and designers, and all of the first assistant ADs, assistant directors and second assistant directors. And there was so much grumbling and griping, and it was always because of the hierarchy, this very strict hierarchy, and the director always set that tone. And there was very often, the director was very often male, was very often my way or the highway. And it just made people so upset. And then I would go and do this work with them, and I would watch them design or create, and I was just blown away by their talent. And all I kept thinking was, the director doesn't know how talented these people truly are, and if they would just listen, then this whole new arena of possibility would be open by all these different artisans. Because everybody on a film set, it doesn't matter if it's the electrician, the gaffer, I guarantee you they are an artist at some level. And they probably go home and work in their woodworking shop, or they're just an artist in how they dress, how they walk in the world, their style and aesthetic, and they're gifted at this. So when I do film, I just like to say at the outset, this is a very collaborative set. If you have ideas, please speak up. Please bring them to me. And if I'm busy, please bring them to, the first assistant director or to the producer or someone, and make your ideas known. And interestingly, it just makes for an incredible set. Everyone brings their best, and that's what you want. And I want to be very open to people's changes and ideas, because it is a collaborative, it is a team sport. And there's so much that happens when you're making something live, with living, breathing people and sets and locations, that all these possibilities can arise in that moment that you can't possibly predict going in. And do I have time to speak to one specific example?
Totally.
Okay. So we were I think it was the third day of our film shoot, and we were going to actually shoot the opening scene. And, I had storyboarded the whole thing, and it looked like this. And then late that night, the set decorator and the set designer were upstairs setting up this kid's art table. And they were putting all these gems and jewels, all these really cool art supplies, and some drawings. And I was like, whose drawings are those? And Caitlin, the designer, was like, oh, those are mine. And she's like, I've been drawing, forever. So we started going through all these drawings of hers, and I was like, these are beautiful. And then we had this huge conversation about how art can really save lives and change lives and support youth. And I was looking at this table that she and Erin, her assistant, had created. And I was like, oh my God, why am I starting on whatever I was thinking I was going to be starting on? I was like, we need to start on this table with these drawings, with this focus on art and how it saves. And so I got out my phone. It's midnight and people are showing up at 6. And, you know, the schedule's already set. And I just filmed how I saw the opening on this table, and then incorporated these wind chimes that were in the backyard that we were using. And I fired it out to every, you know, the cinematographer and the first AD and my producer, and said, this is how I want to go. We have to change everything in the morning. And because we had such a good, yeah, but this was all because of my conversation with.
Let me just point it out astrologically. This is all because of your fluidity of reducing the attachment to letting the moment describe itself rather than being fixed.
Right. Those assumptions.
Your whole chart is mutable, your sun, moon, and rising. So here's my question. I'm going to do a series of questions now from our podcast. Finish the sentence. I wish that people would.
I wish that people would or could, rather than approaching new things that are new to them with sort of even confusion or anger or suspicion, if they could just approach things that are new to them with wonder.
Love that. If you weren't thinking about making films, doing writing books, what else would you find yourself if you could just like leave an alter version of you over to the right? Is it just the most fulfilling thing and there is nothing else you'd rather do? Is there any other part of you that would love to be?
Well, I think I'd want to be like 1,000 things. Like, I think, I'd want to be like a farmer person in the middle of nowhere. I would definitely want to be some kind of scientist. Just an accomplished scientist, like all the knowledge would already be baked in and I'd be going off on this, on some path of discovery.
Exactly. I was the wrong question to ask you.
I could go on forever, but I am very content in my life right now.
I see that. And here's a question that's also going to be a little tricky. What are the things in life that you can't live without, that you are really aware that feed and nourish your soul?
A time with my son, books or podcasts, or just documentary information, just constant new
rising. Right. Your mind is just sensation.
I know, it's true.
Okay, here's a really cool question. If there was a person in your life that you looked up to, or you wished you could have dead or alive, that you wished you could have a conversation with, like you could just sit down and say, can I ask you a few questions?
Wow. God, that's so hard. I mean, again, it's like.
Could be more than one, Miss Gemini Rising. Please.
I got so many. I mean, it'd be like Madame Curie, Francis Bacon, Prince, who else? Jeanette Winterson, Einstein.
Can you imagine you sitting having a conversation?
Oh my God, that would be mind-boggling. Oh, what's her name? Yeah, see, now this is where my like hard drive is. I'm up against the wall because I can't remember names a lot of times. I can't remember names or people, although I know their work and I know what they discovered. But Lynn Margulis, who was, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, Margulis, Rachel Carson, women who were in the scientists fascinate me.
It's so funny. Okay. And then when is the last time that you cried?
Oh my God, I feel like I cry every day. I mean, not in a like sobbing kind of way, but I definitely tear up a lot, especially now that I'm getting older. It's just, I think it's a bit of bittersweet. There's a word in Japanese, I think it's called monogashi, which is something like the passing of the cherry blossoms, that moment they've just left their prime and they're falling back. And it's a sense, not that I think my life is falling back, but it's a sense that life is fleeting and moments are so precious and wanting to really hold them. and then I get emotional about that, I guess.
It's so beautiful. Oh my God, you're so in love with life. And are you worried about the environment? Have you done, this is part of our podcast that
we've talked about that. So I know that we've talked about it, and yes, I am. And I walk this weird tension between, on the one hand, seeing scientifically and objectively, seeing the damage that's being done, realizing the scope and the time scale and how unprecedented that is. And it is terrifying, especially as a parent. But the other side of the coin that I'm constantly seeing is this sort of optimism and belief that if not humans, then life itself will right itself. Do we survive that? Yes. Do we survive it how we think? Probably not. And I also think that we always tend to hyper-focus, and hyper-focusing is dangerous. I know I used to take flying lessons, because if you hyper-focus, you don't see what's around you and what could be coming. And I think you and I talked about this, where sometimes the things that concern me more are the things that we don't even realize are coming, that may or may not be related to or exacerbated by climate change and loss of biodiversity and things like that. And of course, a big one of those is, what will be the social impact of climate change, which to me is one of the most terrifying parts. What people could end up doing to one another as a result of change they can't adapt fast enough to. Adapting fast enough. Yeah.
So true.
That's my concern.
I can feel this is so Gemini, Pisces. Pisces are two fish going in opposite directions. Yeah. Gemini are two twins. So you have a lot of mixtures of cross.
The twins. See, there's the twins, two people in one.
Exactly. You have crossbreeding.
Right. Yeah.
You're always expanding and expanding. And yet the Virgo in you keeps wanting to ground it and bring it back to earth. Yeah. So that you can actually apply this with your films and your plays and your books and your continual connection with people. And I feel so honored that I'm in your circle. We live in the same town. And every time, and that was so funny when we started this, and she was like, what will I talk about? I was like, oh my God. That was the funniest question I've ever heard. What will I talk about?
Little word. That's a long time talking for 45 minutes.
Well, guess what?
Do we do it?
Yes.
Yay.
And it was effortless. And you took us on the ride. From the single takeaway for me in this conversation is the authentic human that you are, which is non-linear in classical sense of being human, that you've let yourself expand your male, female, your scientist, artist. You've combined things that don't go together at all.
Right. And that's what I love. That's what I love. And I hope to encourage more people to do that. I mean, you don't have to be queer, but you can accept and explore other sides of yourself and see them, recognize them, acknowledge them in other people in a way that isn't threatening. It's just self-acceptance and acceptance of other.
And if that isn't Astrology 101, this is my promise this lifetime, to encourage and distinguish uniqueness in people with celebratory expression, because I'm like, this is the coolest chart I've ever seen. Someone once got their feelings hurt when they first met me, and they came and they worked with me, and then they came to one of my classes and they were like, I thought I was so special until I realized you tell everybody that. But it's true.
But it's such a beautiful thing that you do, because you mine potential in people and you put it out on the table where they can see it. And once you can see it, as they say, you can see it, you can be it. But I love how you mine potential for people and encourage them to embrace it because it is of them. And that's your gift in this lifetime.
And you know how much fun it was? It is, first of all, I'm a mirror in this lifetime. I reflect people, and working with you, I had so much fun being you. I always tell people, they say, why do you charge so much? And I was like, I'm going to spend the next day and a half being you. And sometimes it's like, whoa, but for you, it was like, this doesn't have to end, does it? I was because my Gemini really relates to the open-minded fascination with all things, which is how I got this podcast.
Yeah, which is it's so great. And I'm enjoying listening to it. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so you guys, how would they be able, there's another book. So you wrote The Way, and then I read the next book.
Escapement, which is, it's a queer love story, sort of an untold love story that incidentally I've adapted into a screenplay and intend very much to bring that to the big screen.
So go look The Escapement, The Way, Kristen Wolf. And by the way, you just validated astrology in spades. So that wasn't the perfect Aquarius on the midheaven, Gemini rising, a full moon in Virgo who brought it all down, and the genuine love that you have for this life, that may you continue to share that and be our example for what it is to not limit any mindset and continue to ask the questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Debra.
Thank you so much for listening. We want to keep this conversation going with you, so please subscribe to our podcast and leave a rating and review to make sure you never miss an episode. Remember, climate activist by day, human by night. Send Debra a DM on Instagram at Debra Silverman Astrology and visit DebraSilvermanAstrology.com. And we're going to leave you like we leave every single episode. Make it your mission to change the world.